Atlanta started as a transportation hub for railroads. It got really crowded in the middle. By the late 1880s, they began to build beltline railroads to go outside of that center. And there were 4 different ones. So Ryan Gravel's idea to connect them was unusual because they never were connected. They were owned by 4 different railroads. And there were industry built up around them. People began to live around them. And then the streetcars came in the late 1800s, and there was this magnificent network of streetcars in Atlanta. And in their infinite wisdom, 1 year after I was born in 1948, they destroyed all of the streetcars in Atlanta. Why? Because they were old-fashioned. Why? Because starting around 1915, Atlanta really began to switch to automobiles and trucks. There's a picture in the book of downtown Atlanta in 1914, and it had a few streetcars. It had a lot of pedestrians just walking across the street in 5 points of Atlanta. And there were some horses and buggies. And there were a couple of cars. And then there's a picture on the next page from 1924, 10 years later. And it was all cars with some streetcars packed in. And so people began to complain that the streetcars were in the way of the cars, and there was traffic jams. And so they ended up building the streets over the middle of town. That's how how underground Atlanta came to be. In the process of cars and trucks taking over, these beltline railroads died. The industries moved further out because it was cheaper land and they could be serviced by trucks. So by the 1990s, when Ryan was writing this master's thesis, it was mostly a corridor of kudzu. I have a picture in the book that's just covered with vines and weeds, and there were homeless encampments along it. And so Ryan wrote this thing and said, we should, you know, people are beginning to come back into town. We should turn this into this vital network, take advantage of the infrastructure that we already have instead of trying to make up some grand new thing, which Atlanta tends to do. And he saw it as something that could really change the city. It was very well written, and it's actually online. You can find his thesis. And also, let me just say, Ryan wrote a book himself called Where We Want to Live that came out last year. It's a very good book. And our books are kind of complementary because his is kind of a big picture book about what we should do with cities, and et cetera. Mine is a very, you'll find, nitty-gritty book and sort of down on the streets and meeting the people there, and a different approach. And mine is much more about Atlanta specifically. So he wrote this brilliant thesis and he put it on the shelf and he thought nothing would ever come of it, like most master's theses. And so he went to work for an architectural firm, and one day, a few years later, at lunch, he and his colleagues were just talking about what they'd written their master's thesis on. And he explained his, and they said, wow, that's fantastic. Can you bring that in? Let us look at it. And they read it, and they said, you've got to do something with it. And so together, they wrote a letter, and they sent it to every Georgia politician and planner and environmental people, and they all wrote back and said, that's a terrific idea, good luck with that. And that, except one person, who is Kathy Willard, who is actually running for mayor right now, along with 8 other people in the city of Atlanta. And Kathy championed this idea, and so did Ryan, and they sort of built a grassroots organization for a few years. In 2004, Mayor Shirley Franklin took it on, and it developed into a bureaucracy, which we have now. She found Ray Weeks, who was a businessman who had sort of semi-retired and had enough money where he could donate his time, which he did for 4 years to this project. And I've gotten to know all of these people, and I've interviewed like 400 people for this book in the last 6 years since I began to work on it in 2011. And so they tried to figure out how could they fund it Oh, and in the process, I should say, Ryan's original idea of running streetcars around morphed very quickly. His friends said, well, why don't we put a trail by it where that people could ride their bikes on it? And why don't we have, you know, people be able to walk along it? And then a guy named Jim Langford, who was at the time in charge of the Trust for Public Land, somebody approached him and said they wanted help turning the sort of derelict land south of this big old derelict Sears building on Ponce de Leon Avenue into a park. And they said, you know, you could make this into a park and you could alleviate all the flooding by building a retention pond there. And he thought that was a great idea, but the Beltline was all in the news at that point, the idea of it. And he said, you know, he looked at the map, it goes right up to Piedmont Park. It goes through Piedmont Park. If we built this park down here, and oh look, there's this other little park down here in this neighborhood, and he realized that it connected a bunch of parks. Why not make it a greenway? Why not make it a linear park that connected parks? And so he hired Alexander Garvin, who is a world-famous city planner, who I also got to know through this, to come down here and to try to figure out what kind of parks you could have. And Atlanta is severely underparked. We have a lot of trees in this city, beautiful trees, but most of them are in people's backyards. Most of them are not in public places. And in metro Atlanta, which is this huge sprawling mess of 6 million people or so now, they're losing land at an alarming rate and losing trees at an alarming rate.